The train rattled to a halt, its wheels screeching against the frozen tracks. A dense fog of smoke and ash hung over the platform, mingling with the stench of burning wood and flesh. We had been traveling for days, crammed into the cold, steel carriages, our breath visible in the frigid air. As we disembarked, the sheer scale of the destruction that awaited us in Stalingrad was beyond anything we could have imagined. The city, once a thriving industrial hub, was now a nightmarish landscape of twisted metal and crumbling buildings. Charred ruins stood like skeletal sentinels against the grey sky, their windows shattered, their walls pocked with bullet holes. The Volga River, a vital lifeline for the Soviet defenders, flowed sluggishly nearby, its icy surface marred by debris and the occasional bloated corpse. I tightened the straps on my helmet and adjusted my rifle, the weight of the weapon a familiar comfort. Around me, my comrades did the same, their faces set in grim determination. We were young, most of us barely out of our teens, yet we had seen enough death and destruction to age us beyond our years. We had fought in Poland, France, and the steppes of Russia, but nothing had prepared us for the inferno that was Stalingrad. Hans. Over here I heard Dieter call out, waving me over. Dieter was one of my closest friends, a lanky Bavarian with a quick wit and an easy smile. He stood with Fritz and Klaus, two other members of our unit. We had been through thick and thin together, and the bond we shared was unbreakable. "Can you believe this place?" Fritz muttered, his voice tinged with awe and horror. "It's like we've stepped into the mouth of hell." Klaus nodded, his usually jovial face drawn and serious. "Keep your wits about you, boys. This isn't like the other battles. This is something else entirely." We made our way through the ruins, stepping over rubble and the occasional body. The city was eerily silent, save for the distant rumble of artillery and the sporadic crack of gunfire. The Soviets were out there, hidden among the ruins, watching and waiting. Every shadow seemed to conceal an enemy, every sound a potential threat. Our orders were to hold our position and secure a section of the city. We were assigned to a bombed-out factory, its hulking shell providing some semblance of cover. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with debris. We quickly set up a makeshift command post, arranging sandbags and positioning our machine guns. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and the factory grew colder. We huddled together for warmth, our breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The distant sounds of battle continued, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond our makeshift sanctuary. "Do you ever think about why we're here?" Dieter asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "I mean, really think about it. What are we fighting for?" I glanced at him, seeing the doubt and weariness in his eyes. It was a question we all grappled with, though few dared to voice it. "We're here because we have to be," I replied, my words sounding hollow even to my own ears. "We're soldiers. This is our duty." Dieter nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. None of us were. The propaganda we had been fed seemed far removed from the grim reality we faced each day. The promises of glory and victory felt like cruel jokes in the face of such relentless carnage. The next morning, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the true extent of the devastation. We ventured out cautiously, scanning the ruins for any sign of movement. The streets were strewn with debris, and the smell of death hung heavy in the air. Suddenly, a shot rang out, and Klaus dropped to the ground with a cry of pain. We scrambled for cover, our hearts pounding. The Soviets were close, their snipers picking us off one by one. "Medic," I shouted, crawling over to Klaus. Blood seeped through his uniform, staining the snow beneath him. He clutched his side, his face pale and contorted with pain. "Hang in there, Klaus," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll get you out of here." The medic arrived, and we carried Klaus back to the factory, his groans echoing in the stillness. It was a stark reminder of the peril we faced, the ever-present danger that could strike at any moment. As the days turned into weeks, we settled into a grim routine. The fighting was relentless, a brutal dance of advance and retreat. We lost more friends, their deaths a constant ache in our hearts. Yet, through it all, we held our ground, driven by a mix of duty, camaraderie, and the sheer will to survive. Stalingrad was hell, a place where hope seemed to wither and die. But amid the ruins and the bloodshed, we found moments of humanity, small acts of kindness and bravery that reminded us of what we were fighting for. We clung to those moments, finding strength in each other as we faced the horrors of war. The battle for Stalingrad had only just begun, and we knew the worst was yet to come. But in that shattered city, among the ruins and the ashes, we forged bonds that would endure long after the war was over. For in the heart of hell, we found not just comrades, but brothers. Winter descended on Stalingrad with a ferocity that defied comprehension. The city, already a war-torn husk, now faced the additional torment of biting winds and relentless snow. Each day, the cold seemed to deepen, wrapping the city in a suffocating blanket of ice and misery. We huddled in the factory, our breath visible in the frigid air, every movement stiff and painful. Our uniforms, designed for European climates, offered little protection against the Russian winter. Frostbite gnawed at our fingers and toes, turning simple tasks into ordeals. The cold was a silent, invisible enemy, as deadly as any Soviet bullet. The first light of dawn revealed a world transformed. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling sounds and rendering the city eerily silent. The once muddy streets were now treacherous ice paths, and the Volga River, our looming barrier, was a solid sheet of white. We moved cautiously, our footsteps crunching in the snow, every step a reminder of the brutal cold that permeated our bones. "Keep moving. Keep warm," our sergeant barked, his breath misting in the air. We shuffled along, rifles slung over our shoulders, trying to generate heat. The sky was a leaden gray, promising more snow, more cold. The Soviet snipers, once our primary concern, seemed less deadly than the frost that crept into our bones. Inside the factory, we scavenged for anything that could burn. Wooden crates, shattered furniture, even scraps of cloth were tossed into makeshift stoves. The small fires provided little warmth, but were better than nothing. We took turns huddling around the flickering flames, our hands outstretched, trying to ward off the numbing cold. "Here," Dieter said, handing me a small tin cup filled with steaming liquid. It was Assat's coffee, a weak substitute, but the warmth it provided was real. I sipped it gratefully, feeling a small measure of heat spread through my chest. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice hoarse. We sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. The war seemed distant in those quiet moments, replaced by the immediate struggle for survival against the elements. Outside, the Soviets were facing the same conditions. We occasionally glimpsed them through the ruins, bundled in thick coats, their breath misting in the air. They were our enemies, but in the face of such overwhelming cold, they seemed more like fellow sufferers. The lines of hatred blurred in the face of a common adversary. One morning, as we patrolled the perimeter, we encountered a Soviet soldier. He was young, barely older than me, and had succumbed to the cold. His body lay half buried in the snow, his face a mask of frozen agony. I stared at him, feeling a pang of sorrow. War had reduced us to this young man dying alone in a frozen wasteland. "Leave him," the sergeant said gruffly. "We have our own to worry about." We continued on, the image of the dead soldier etched into my mind. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the thin line between survival and death in this frozen hell. Supplies were running low. Our rations, already meager, dwindled to almost nothing. Hunger gnawed at us, adding another layer of suffering. We scavenged for food, sharing whatever we could find. The rare tins of meat or bread were treasures, hoarded and rationed out with great care. One night, as we huddled around a small fire, Fritz pulled out a tattered photograph. It was of his family, smiling and happy. He stared at it for a long time, his eyes distant. "I wonder if they know what it's like here," he said softly. "I wonder if they understand what we're going through." We all had similar thoughts. Our families, safe and warm back home, couldn't possibly comprehend the horrors we faced daily. The letters we wrote, if they even reached their destinations, were sanitized versions of the truth. We spared our loved ones the grim reality of our existence, choosing instead to offer them hope and reassurance. The days blurred together, a monotonous cycle of cold, hunger, and fear. The Soviets launched sporadic attacks, probing our defenses, but the weather seemed to sap their strength as much as ours. The once thriving city was now a frozen wasteland, a battleground where death stalked us all. One particularly cold night, we heard the distant rumble of tanks. The Soviets were massing for another offensive. We scrambled to our positions, the cold forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. The ground trembled as the tanks approached, their engines roaring. "Get ready," the sergeant shouted. We braced ourselves, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the darkness. The first tank appeared, its massive form looming out of the snow. It was followed by infantry, their shapes barely visible in the blizzard. Fire, the command rang out, and the night exploded with the sounds of battle. Bullets whizzed past, traces lighting up the darkness. The tanks fired, their shells creating deafening explosions. The cold was forgotten in the chaos, replaced by the familiar terror of combat. We fought desperately, the factory becoming a fortress. The Soviets pressed their attack, but we held our ground. The battle raged for hours, the night filled with the screams of the wounded and the dying. The snow was stained with blood, the pure white landscape defiled by the brutality of war. As dawn broke, the Soviets finally retreated, leaving behind their dead and wounded. We slumped to the ground, exhausted and numb. The cold returned with a vengeance, seeping into our bones. I looked around at my comrades, their faces haggard and drawn. We had survived another night, but at what cost? The factory, once a symbol of our resilience, now felt like a tomb. "Good job, boys," the sergeant said, his voice weary. We held them off. We nodded, too tired to speak. The sun rose slowly, casting a pale light over the battlefield. The tanks lay silent, their hulks partially buried in the snow. The bodies of the fallen, both German and Soviet, were stark reminders of the price we paid for survival. As we gathered our wounded and buried our dead, I couldn't help but think of the futility of it all. Stalingrad had become a symbol of our struggle, a place where honor and duty were measured in lives lost and suffering endured. We fought not for glory or conquest, but for survival. And in this frozen wasteland, survival was the only victory that mattered. The winter showed no signs of relenting. The cold remained an ever-present enemy, a force that cared nothing for our suffering. But amid the ice and snow, we found a grim determination. We would endure, for ourselves and for each other. In the heart of the frozen battlefield, we forged a bond that even the harshest winter could not break. The factory walls shuddered as another artillery shell detonated nearby, showering us with dust and debris. The once sturdy structure that had provided us shelter now felt like a death trap, its stability threatened by the relentless Soviet barrage. Day and night, the shelling continued, a constant reminder of the Soviets' unyielding pressure. We crouched in the corners, our ears ringing from the explosions, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. There was no escape from the noise, the fear, the sense of impending doom. Every thud of artillery, every crack of rifle fire, brought the enemy closer. "Stay low, and keep your heads down," the sergeant barked, his voice barely audible over the din. We obeyed, pressing ourselves against the cold, hard floor, clutching our rifles like lifelines. Through the haze of smoke and dust, I caught glimpses of my comrades. Dieter, his face set in grim determination, his knuckles white as he gripped his weapon. Fritz, muttering a prayer under his breath, his eyes squeezed shut. Klaus, his leg bandaged from his earlier wound, struggling to keep his composure. "We can't hold out much longer like this," I whispered to Dieter during a rare lull in the shelling. He nodded, his expression bleak. "We need reinforcements. Supplies. Something. Anything." Our rations were nearly exhausted, and what little we had left offered scant comfort against the gnawing hunger. The cold seeped into our bones, turning even the simplest movements into agonizing efforts. Yet, despite everything, we held on, driven by a mix of duty, fear, and the unspoken bond between us. The Soviets were relentless. Each day brought new waves of attacks, their soldiers surging forward in seemingly endless numbers. They were well equipped and determined, fighting with a ferocity born of desperation. For them, Stalingrad was more than a city, it was a symbol, a line that could not be crossed. We repelled their assaults with everything we had, our machine guns rattling, grenades exploding in the frigid air. The factory became a fortress, each room a battlefield, each corridor a death trap. The Soviets pressed on, their bodies piling up in the snow, but still, they came. One particularly brutal assault began just before dawn. The sky was a pale gray, the cold biting and unforgiving. The Soviets launched a coordinated attack, their artillery softening our defenses before their infantry surged forward. The ground shook with the force of the bombardment, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. "Here they come," Fritz shouted, his voice tinged with panic. We scrambled to our positions, bracing for the onslaught. The first wave of Soviet soldiers emerged from the smoke, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. They moved with a grim determination, their bayonets glinting in the weak sunlight. "Fire," the sergeant ordered, and our guns roared to life. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of death and destruction. Bullets tore through the air, cutting down the advancing Soviets. They fell in droves, their bodies crumpling to the ground, but still, they came. The second wave followed the first, then a third, each more determined than the last. A Soviet soldier reached our position, his bayonet aimed at my chest. I fired instinctively, the recoil of my rifle jolting through me. He collapsed at my feet, his lifeless eyes staring up at me. There was no time to think, no time to feel. Another enemy was already upon me. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat in the frozen ruins. The factory echoed with the sounds of struggle, the cries of the wounded, the final gasps of the dying. We fought like cornered animals, every ounce of our strength focused on survival. "Fall back," the sergeant shouted, as the Soviets pressed their advantage. "Regroup," in the main hall. We retreated, dragging our wounded with us, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The main hall offered more space, but it also meant we were more exposed. We formed a defensive perimeter, our backs to the wall, our eyes fixed on the shattered doorways through which the Soviets would soon come. Their relentless Klaus panted, his face pale from blood loss. "How many more can there be?" "Enough to overwhelm us, if we don't hold together," Dida replied grimly. We didn't have to wait long. The Soviets stormed into the hall, their numbers overwhelming. We fired in short, controlled bursts, trying to conserve ammunition, but it was a losing battle. They just kept coming, an unstoppable tide of humanity. In the chaos, I found myself fighting side by side with Dida. We covered each other, our movements synchronized from countless battles fought together. We pushed back the Soviets, step by bloody step, but it was clear we couldn't hold out forever. Just as it seemed we would be overrun, a miracle happened. A squad of German reinforcements burst into the hall, their rifles blazing. They pushed the Soviets back, buying us precious moments to regroup. "Reinforcements," Fritz shouted, his voice filled with relief. The fresh troops fought with a ferocity that matched the Soviets. Together, we managed to drive them out of the factory, securing our position once more. The cost was high. Many of our comrades lay dead or dying, their blood mingling with the snow and rubble. As the fighting died down, we collapsed to the ground, exhausted and numb. The reinforcements tended to the wounded and set up stronger defenses. We had survived another day, but the battle was far from over. "How much longer can this go on?" I asked Dida, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, his eyes hollow. "As long as it takes. We can't give up. Not now." Stalingrad had become a test of endurance, a battle of wills. The Soviets were relentless, their determination as fierce as our own. We fought not just for victory, but for survival, for each other. In the frozen ruins of the city, amid the blood and the carnage, we found a grim resolve. The winter showed no signs of relenting. The cold remained an ever-present enemy, sapping our strength and testing our spirits. But amid the ice and snow, we held on, driven by the hope that somehow we would endure. In the heart of the frozen battlefield, we forged a bond that even the harshest winter could not break. The days blurred into weeks, the weeks into months. The once majestic city of Stalingrad had been reduced to a landscape of shattered ruins and skeletal buildings. Every corner of the city bore the scars of relentless combat, and every street was a graveyard for the countless lives lost in the struggle. The battle had taken on a grim rhythm, an unending cycle of attack and counterattack, survival and death. The factory, our stronghold, had become a testament to human endurance. Its walls, once sturdy and imposing, were now pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel scars. The air inside was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and sweat, mingled with the metallic tang of blood. We moved like ghosts through the wreckage, our faces gaunt and hollow-eyed, our bodies weakened by hunger and exhaustion. One morning, as the first pale light of dawn crept through the broken windows, we received orders to prepare for another Soviet assault. We gathered in the main hall, our breaths visible in the frigid air. The reinforcements had brought some respite, but the toll of constant combat weighed heavily on us all. "Listen up," the sergeant said, his voice firm but weary. "We've received intel that the Soviets are planning a major push to break through our lines. We need to hold this position at all costs. Reinforcements are on their way, but until then, it's up to us." We nodded, our faces set in grim determination. There was no need for speeches or grand gestures. We knew what was at stake. The factory was more than a stronghold, it was our lifeline, our last bastion against the encroaching tide. As we took our positions, I found myself next to Dieter. He was cleaning his rifle with meticulous care, his hands steady, despite the tremors of fatigue that plagued us all. "Ready for another day in hell?" I asked, attempting a weak smile. He glanced up, his eyes weary but resolute. "Ready as I'll ever be. Just another day in paradise, right?" We shared a brief moment of camaraderie, a fragile thread of humor amid the bleakness. It was these small moments that kept us going, the shared laughter and whispered conversations that reminded us of our humanity. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. The factory was eerily silent, the calm before the storm. We listened intently, straining to catch any hint of the approaching enemy. The tension was palpable, a living thing that coiled around us, tightening with each passing second. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the distant rumble of artillery. The ground trembled beneath our feet as the Soviets unleashed their barrage, softening our defenses before their infantry moved in. We braced ourselves, our eyes fixed on the shattered doorways and windows. "Here they come!" someone shouted, and the factory erupted into chaos. The Soviets advanced in waves, their shouts mingling with the deafening roar of gunfire. We fired back with everything we had, our rifles chattering, our machine guns spitting death. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the acrid smell of gunpowder burning our nostrils. I fought alongside Dieter, our movements a choreographed dance of survival. We covered each other, our bullets finding their marks, but the Soviets kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. The factory became a battleground, each room a kill zone, each corridor a death trap. In the midst of the chaos, I saw a Soviet soldier break through our lines. He was young, no older than me, his face a mask of determination and fear. He raised his rifle, aiming directly at me. Time seemed to slow, the noise fading into a dull roar. Without thinking, I fired. The recoil jolted through me, and the soldier crumpled to the ground, his lifeless eyes staring up at me. A chill ran down my spine, a cold deeper than the winter that surrounded us. I had seen death countless times, but in that moment, it felt personal, a life snuffed out by my own hand. "Keep moving," Dieter's shout snapped me back to reality. "They're breaking through on the left." I tore my gaze away from the fallen soldier and joined the desperate defense. The Soviets were pressing hard, their determination unwavering. We fought with everything we had, our bodies and spirits pushed to the breaking point. Hours passed, each second a struggle for survival. The factory was filled with the sounds of battle, the cries of the wounded, the final gasps of the dying. We held our ground, inch by bloody inch, refusing to yield. Finally, as the first light of dusk began to fade, the Soviets retreated. Their bodies littered the ground, a grim testament to the ferocity of the fight. We slumped to the floor, our bodies aching, our minds numb. "We did it," Fritz said, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We held them off." "At what cost?" Klaus muttered, his face pale and drawn. "How many more times can we do this?" None of us had an answer. The battle for Stalingrad had become a test of endurance, a battle of wills. We fought not just for victory, but for survival, for each other. In the frozen ruins of the city, amid the blood and the carnage, we found a grim resolve. As the night settled in, we tended to our wounded and fortified our defenses. The reinforcements had not yet arrived, and we knew the Soviets would be back. But for now, we had a brief respite, a moment of uneasy peace. I sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. The image of the young Soviet soldier haunted me, his lifeless eyes a stark reminder of the cost of war. I wondered if he had a family, if someone was waiting for him to come home. The thought was a heavy burden, one that I carried with me through the long, cold night. In the darkness, surrounded by my comrades, I found a measure of solace. We were not alone in our suffering, not alone in our struggle. We had each other, and in that, there was strength. The battle for Stalingrad was far from over, but we would face it together. In the heart of the frozen battlefield, amid the shadows of the past, we forged a bond that even the harshest winter could not break. And in that bond, we found the will to endure. The relentless winter showed no mercy, and neither did the Soviets. The battle for Stalingrad had become a nightmare with no end in sight. Each day bled into the next, a blur of blood, sweat, and snow. Our once formidable factory had transformed into a fortress of desperation. The walls, pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel scars, echoed with the memories of those who had fallen. We knew another Soviet assault was imminent. The reports of their preparations were grim, and our supplies were critically low. Hunger gnawed at us incessantly, and the cold sapped our strength. Yet, we clung to the hope that reinforcements would arrive in time. Without them, we were doomed. "Hold this position," the sergeant instructed, his voice steady despite the dire situation. "Reinforcements are on their way. We need to hold out until they get here." We exchanged silent nods, our resolve steeled by necessity. There was no room for doubt. We had to survive. The night before the assault, we fortified our defenses, using anything we could find to strengthen our positions. Old crates, broken machinery, even the bodies of fallen comrades became part of our makeshift barricades. As the sun set, the factory was bathed in an eerie, spectral light, the shadows deepening the sense of foreboding. We took our positions, each man understanding the gravity of the situation. The tension was palpable, a living entity that coiled around us, tightening with each passing moment. I found myself next to Dieter once more, our bond a lifeline in the midst of chaos. "Think we'll make it through this one?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Dieter's gaze was unwavering. "We have to. There's no other choice." The first sign of the Soviet advance came with the distant rumble of tanks, their tracks grinding through the snow and rubble. The ground shook, and the air filled with the ominous thud of artillery. The Soviets were coming, and they were bringing everything they had. "Steady," the sergeant called out. "Wait for my command." We braced ourselves, fingers tightening on triggers, eyes fixed on the darkened windows and doorways. The factory, our last stand, was about to be engulfed in the flames of battle. The Soviets emerged from the gloom, their figures dark and menacing. They moved with a relentless determination, their rifles raised, their bayonets gleaming. The artillery barrage intensified, the explosions deafening, the ground churning under our feet. Fire, the sergeant's command, cut through the chaos, and our guns roared to life. The factory became a maelstrom of noise and violence. Bullets tore through the air, grenades exploded, and screams mingled with the roar of combat. The Soviets pressed forward, their bodies falling in heaps as we cut them down. But still, they came, wave after wave, their resolve unbroken. I fought alongside Dieter, our movements synchronized by countless battles fought together. We covered each other, our bullets finding their marks, but the Soviets kept coming. The factory became a slaughterhouse, each room a kill zone, each corridor a deadly gauntlet. The fighting was brutal and unrelenting. We were forced to retreat, room by room, as the Soviets pressed their advantage. The main hall became our last stand, a desperate fight for survival. We formed a defensive line, our backs to the wall, our eyes fixed on the enemy. "Hold the line," the sergeant shouted, his voice hoarse. "We can't let them break through." We fought with everything we had, our bodies and spirits pushed to the breaking point. The Soviets were relentless, their determination as fierce as our own. The main hall was filled with the sounds of battle, the cries of the wounded, the final gasps of the dying. Just when it seemed we would be overrun, a miracle happened. The reinforcements arrived, their rifles blazing, their shouts rallying us to fight on. They pushed the Soviets back, buying us precious moments to regroup. "We're not done yet," Dieter shouted, his voice filled with determination. "We can do this." The fresh troops fought with a ferocity that matched the Soviets. Together, we managed to drive them out of the factory, securing our position once more. The cost was high. Many of our comrades lay dead or dying, their blood mingling with the mud and rubble. As the fighting died down, we collapsed to the ground, exhausted and numb. The reinforcements tended to the wounded and set up stronger defenses. We had survived another day, but the battle was far from over. In the darkness, surrounded by my comrades, I found a measure of solace. We were not alone in our suffering, not alone in our struggle. We had each other, and in that, there was strength. The next day dawned cold and gray, the sky a heavy blanket of clouds. We moved through the factory like shadows, our movements slow and deliberate. The Soviets had been repelled, but the sense of dread remained. We knew they would be back, and we knew we had to be ready. I found myself thinking of home, of the life I had left behind. The memories were like a distant dream, a world that no longer seemed real. Here, in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the past felt like a ghost, haunting my thoughts. As I sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Dieter, his face drawn and weary. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice soft. I shrugged, unable to find the words. The weight of everything we had been through, everything we had lost, was too much to put into words. "We'll get through this," Dieter said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "We have to." I nodded, finding strength in his words. We had come this far, endured so much. The battle for Stalingrad was not just a fight for survival, it was a testament to our will, our courage, our humanity. And as long as we had each other, we would continue to fight, continue to endure. In the heart of the frozen battlefield, amid the shadows of the past and the promise of tomorrow, we found the strength to face whatever came next. The last stand of Stalingrad was not just a fight for a city, it was a fight for our very souls. And in that fight, we would not be defeated. The battle for Stalingrad reached its zenith as the Soviet offensive grew more fierce and coordinated. Despite our relentless efforts and the sacrifices of countless men, the tide of war was turning inexorably against us. The once unyielding fortress that was our factory had become a shadow of its former self, its defenses crumbling under the weight of Soviet resolve. We had fought bravely, holding the line with a tenacity born of desperation and camaraderie. But with each passing day, it became clearer that our situation was dire. The Soviets' numbers were overwhelming, their tactics increasingly effective. Our supplies were exhausted, our strength waning. The harsh reality settled over us like the biting cold. One fateful evening, as dusk cloaked the city in darkness, the sergeant called us together in the dimly lit remains of the factory's command center. His face was drawn, the weight of the decision he was about to make evident in every line of his weathered features. "Listen up," he began, his voice heavy with resignation. "We've received orders from higher up. The situation is untenable. The Soviets have encircled the city. Reinforcements aren't coming. We're to prepare for surrender." A stunned silence followed his announcement. The word surrender hung in the air like a leaden weight, its implications sinking in slowly. The harsh reality of our predicament was almost too much to bear. "Surrender," Fritz echoed, his voice trembling. "We fought so hard. All this." The sergeant nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. "We fought bravely, but the battle is lost. There's no point in throwing more lives away. We need to ensure the safety of those who are still alive." The order was clear. We were to cease all hostilities, raise white flags, and prepare for the arrival of Soviet forces. It was a bitter pill to swallow, the culmination of months of grueling combat and unending suffering. Yet, it was the only option left. The next morning, we began the process of surrendering. We draped white cloths over our weapons and barricades, signaling our capitulation. The factory, once a bastion of resistance, was now a symbol of our defeat. As the Soviets advanced, their soldiers moved through the ruins with a mix of weariness and triumph. When the Soviet forces finally entered the factory, their expressions were a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. They had broken through our defenses, a testament to their tenacity and the overwhelming odds against us. We stood amidst the wreckage, our faces a mixture of weariness and resignation, as the Soviets took control. The aftermath of the surrender was a stark contrast to the chaos of battle. The factory, now silent, was filled with the sounds of subdued conversations and the shuffle of boots on rubble. We were gathered in a corner of the factory, our weapons taken away, our hands empty and our spirits heavy. As the Soviet officers conducted their inspections and took stock of their victory, we sat in a daze, the weight of our surrender settling over us. The factory that had been our last stand was now a prisoner of war camp. The survivors of our unit were processed and taken to a makeshift holding area. Among the captured, I saw Dieter, Fritz, and Klaus, their faces etched with exhaustion and resignation. We exchanged somber glances, a silent acknowledgement of the shared hardship we had endured. There were no words that could capture the complexity of our emotions' defeat, sorrow, and the bitter sting of surrender. As the days passed, we were transported to a Soviet prisoner of war camp. The camp was a stark contrast to the ruins of Stalingrad, a bleak and desolate place surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The camp was cold and harsh, a far cry from the factory that had once been our home and fortress. In the camp, we faced a new reality. The comforts of the factory were replaced by the harshness of captivity. Food was scarce, and the conditions were harsh. The Soviets were wary, but generally treated us with a grudging respect. We were enemies, but also fellow soldiers who had endured a shared ordeal. In the midst of our confinement, I found myself reflecting on the battle, on the choices we had made, and on the lives that had been lost. The memories of the factory, of the fighting, and of the comrades who had fallen haunted my thoughts. I replayed the events over and over, searching for meaning in the chaos. One evening, as the sun set over the camp, casting long shadows across the bleak landscape, I sat alone by the fence, staring into the distance. The cold wind cut through my clothes, a reminder of the harshness of our new existence. I thought about home, about the life I had left behind, and about the future that lay ahead. Dieter joined me, his face lined with weariness. We sat in silence, the weight of our experiences heavy between us. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and reflective. "What do you think it all means?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I shrugged. The question too complex for easy answers. I don't know. Maybe it's about survival. About making it through, despite everything. Dieter nodded, his expression thoughtful. We survived, didn't we? Even if the battle was lost, we're still here. His words were a small comfort, a reminder that despite the suffering and the defeat, we had endured. The battle for Stalingrad was over, but the struggle within us continued. We had faced unimaginable hardship and had emerged on the other side, scarred but alive. In the quiet moments of reflection, amidst the harshness of captivity, we found solace in each other's presence. The bonds forged in the crucible of battle held fast, providing a measure of strength and understanding. As we settled into our new reality, the memories of Stalingrad remained a haunting presence. But amidst the bleakness of the camp, we found a semblance of hope. The battle was over, but our story was not yet finished. In the shadows of surrender and the echoes of the past, we began to forge a new path forward, one step at a time.